As more and more begin to know, the status quo has got to go. They're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No, a man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
Tucker slayed the mainstream media dragon. There has been much written and said about Tucker Carlson's interview with Russian President Vladimir Putin last week. As of this writing, the video on Twitter alone has been viewed nearly 200 million times, making it likely the most viewed news event in history. Many millions of viewers who may not have had access to the other side of the story were informed that the Russian-Ukraine military conflict did not begin in 2022, as the mainstream media continuously reports, but in fact began 8 years earlier with a U.S.-backed coup in Ukraine. The U.S. media does not report this because they don't want Americans to begin questioning our interventionist foreign policy. They don't want Americans to see that our government meddling in the affairs of other countries, whether by color revolution, sanctions, or bombs, has real and deadly consequences to those on the receiving end of our foreign policy. To me, however, perhaps the most interesting aspect of the Tucker Carlson interview with Putin was the U.S. mainstream media reaction. As Putin himself said during the interview, in the world of propaganda, it's very difficult to defeat the United States. Even a casual look at the U.S. mainstream media's reporting before and after the interview would show how correct he is about that. In the days and weeks before the interview, the U.S. media was filled with stories about how horrible it was that Tucker Carlson was interviewing the Russian president. There was the danger, they all said, that Putin might spread disinformation. That Putin might say something to put his country in a better light was, they were saying, reason enough to not interview him. With that logic, why have journalism at all? Everyone interviewed by journalists, certainly every world leader, will attempt to paint a rosy picture. The job of a journalist in a free society should be to do the reporting and let the people decide. But somehow that has been lost. These days, the mainstream media tells you what to think, and you better not dispute it or you will be canceled. What the U.S. mainstream media was really worried about was that the other side of the story might start to ring true with the public. So they attack the messenger. The CNN reporting on Tucker's interview pretty much sums up the reaction across the board of the U.S. mainstream media. Their headline read, "Tucker Carlson is in Russia to interview Putin. He's already doing the bidding of the Kremlin." By merely doing what used to be called journalism, interviewing and reporting on people and events, whether good or bad, one is doing the bidding of the subject of the interview or report. No wonder fellow journalist Julian Assange has been locked away in a gulag for so many years. He dared to assume that in a free society, being a journalist means reporting the good, the bad, and the ugly, even if it puts those in power in a bad light. In the end, the massive success of the Tucker Carlson interview with Vladimir Putin demonstrates once and for all that the American people are sick to death of their mainstream media propagandists and liars. They are looking not for government narratives, but for truth. That's the really good news about this interview.
So President Biden has no plans to alter his policy of unequivocal support for Israel's slaughter in Gaza, despite claiming in private conversations that he's frustrated with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And this was reported by NBC News on Monday. So sources told NBC that Biden had disparaged Netanyahu in private conversations with other people, including some campaign donors. The sources claimed that Biden said he wanted a ceasefire, but Netanyahu was giving him hell. And in at least 3 instances, Biden referred to the Israeli leader as an a-hole. Biden has even said he believes Netanyahu wants the war to drag on so he can remain in power, as polling in Israel shows they want the Israeli leader to step down once the onslaught in Gaza comes to an end. So that's really something that they're saying Biden has even said, and we've seen these comments from U.S. officials in the media, that they believe Netanyahu's political survival relies on him extending this war, extending this massacre in Gaza for as long as he can, and even potentially provoking a major regional conflict. So Biden even recognizes that, or at least he says he does, and is still giving him all the military aid and all the bombs that he needs. So a yacht belonging to a Russian billionaire that was seized by the U.S. under the pretext of sanctions enforcement in May 2022 is costing the U.S. $7 million per year to maintain. So according to Reuters, the U.S. seized this yacht called the Amadea. I'm not sure exactly how to pronounce that, but it's a $300 million yacht, and the U.S. seized it in Fiji under a warrant alleging that it was owned by Suleiman Karimov, who's a Russian billionaire who was sanctioned by the U.S. in 2014 and 2018. The U.S. wants to auction off the yacht and give the money to Ukraine, but that is being challenged in court by Edward Kudinatov, who is the former CEO of Russia's state-owned oil company, Rosneft, who is not under U.S. sanctions. So he's not under sanctions. I'm not sure if he's a billionaire or not, but he's, a very wealthy Russian. Kudinatov says that the yacht is actually his, and the U.S. is accusing him of acting as a straw owner to cover for Karimov. In October 2023, Kudinatov filed federal court papers in San Diego, where the yacht is currently docked, asserting that he owned it and saying it could not be sold off since he's not under U.S. sanctions. So the Reuters report said that U.S. federal prosecutors said in a court filing issued on Friday that the $600,000 bill the U.S. is paying to maintain this yacht each month, so it's $600,000 a month. That's how much the U.S. is paying. So they're saying that because that is such an excessive bill, that means they should just be able to sell it off, send the money to Ukraine, and call it a day. But lawyers for Kudinatov say that the U.S. attempt to sell the yacht was premature and that they would urge the judge presiding over the case to deny it until he determines whether the seizure was unconstitutional. So it's kind of an interesting situation. It just goes to show it doesn't seem like it was super thought out by the U.S. that, oh, look, we could seize this really expensive yacht and sell it, and now they're stuck maintaining it for $7 million a year. And this is part of this U.S. strategy to steal, that's what it is, steal Russian assets to give more money to the Ukrainian government. So far, the DOJ has facilitated the transfer of some assets of Russian billionaires. I'm not sure of the exact number, but I believe I found Blinken said recently that the U.S. has sent $5.4 million worth of Russian oligarch, as they call them, assets to Ukraine. So the big prize for the U.S. and Ukraine is the $300 billion in Russian central bank funds. So this was frozen by the U.S. and the EU right after the Russian invasion. $300 billion. And basically the U.S., the White House recently threw its support behind a plan to take this money and give it to Ukraine. It's a lot of money. About $67 billion of it is in the U.S., 200-something billion is in the EU, and I know some is in Japan as well. So it's mostly in the EU, and so far the EU has not agreed to this idea yet. And the U.S. would need legislation. They would need to pass laws, and this would be an unprecedented step, actually, basically stealing this money from Russia. And I think it would speed up, de-dollarization. It would make other countries think twice about keeping money, in the U.S. dollar and at the Federal Reserve Bank. So, but that's something that they really want to do. So, especially as Biden is struggling to get this new $60 billion in Ukraine aid passed. So Sudan is something I have not covered in a really long time. Someone mentioned to me on Twitter today that I should do an update on it. And I saw this article. This is from Al Jazeera. So Sudan, it's been 10 months now that since war broke out between the two rival generals, Al-Burhan, who is the head of the army, and then Hameti, as he's known, who is the head of the Rapid Support Forces, which is kind of a paramilitary group. They were in the same military government and everything, and they've been fighting for 10 months. I looked up, the death toll is estimated to be between 12 and 15,000, but there's serious food shortages. Something like 10 million people have been displaced by this war. And, Sudan was already dealing with things like, food shortages, and now it's, of course, war always exacerbates stuff like that. This article is from Al Jazeera just about the warnings of famine in Sudan. The United Nations estimates that about 18 million people are facing emergency levels of hunger, double the figure from last year. A recent internet blackout across the country compounded the crisis by suspending money transfers, which the diaspora relies on to support loved ones in the country. As famine looms, aid agencies are calling for $4.1 billion in funding to avert catastrophe. They quote an expert on famines, Alex De Wall, who I believe Daniel Arison recently cited some of his writing about the situation in Gaza. And he's saying if hunger levels stay where they are, hundreds of thousands of children will die by next year. So just a really bleak outlook for Sudan. And
I got a chip on my shoulder, and that is that even during Iraq War II, especially during Iraq War II, but ever since then too, they never say who's on whose side. They never say who's the shirts and who's the skins. It's just America and the people of Iraq versus the terrorists. They won't even tell you whether they're Sunni or Shia, much less whether they belong to Sadr's faction or Hakim's faction or whatever the hell or why it should matter. And so I find, look at the news and I see that, hey, we're bombing the same guys we put in power and fought 2 civil wars for. And nobody seems to realize that or recognize that or think that it matters. It's just, well, it's Iraq, so we bomb it. That's the American way or something. And I just wonder, like, how you're coming at that. And do you think, is that really the point we should be trying to make here? Is just who the hell is on whose side over there? And why is it that America's fighting against our own interests when you don't have to love the Ayatollah, but his enemy is the bin Ladenites, right?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think a good way to frame it for folks who don't follow foreign policy as closely as we do is just to really point out that the exact same militias that just killed our troops over there, they're the same militias that we're funding because, like you said, there's never really been a clear definition of who's on whose side over there. And that's because Washington, D.C. doesn't want you to scratch the surface. They don't want us to see that, hey, we all realize and recognize that like the Ayatollahs are basically at war with the United States of America. But all the bumbling we did in Iraq, the mistakes that we made, put the Ayatollahs guys, the Badrs, the Hakims, the Sadrists, in charge and gave them power. And then when we had to go back in and defeat ISIS, we basically acted as the Air Force for these same Iranian-backed militias that then turn around when they don't need us anymore and start attacking and killing our troops. So I think we lay that out for the American people and we just say, look, this is just really American taxpayer dollars bombing American taxpayer dollars. And there's no real reason, there's no vital national security interest in us leaving our troops in this location or funding to the tune of billions of dollars. I don't think most people realize our biggest embassy in the world is in Baghdad and probably about to be under siege because of what took place in the last 24 hours. But it's really hard to defend just how preposterous the situation is when you explain it in those very simple terms.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but the official excuse for America's continued presence in Iraq now, call it Iraq War 3.5, is to still help these Shiite forces hunt down and kill the last of the bin Ladenites. Call them ISIS now. It's the same group of Zarqawi's Al-Qaeda in Iraq, right? And so this guy that they just assassinated in Baghdad, who is the head of Kataib Hezbollah, and I guess was the head of the combined PMF, he was one of the main leaders in the anti-ISIS fight there. So it's a two-part question, right? Like on one hand, on the face of it, it's treason. It's fighting on Al-Qaeda's side of the war. Again, flip-flopping back and forth. Again, Al-Qaeda, who knocked the towers down, taking their side against Iran, who just won't do as they're told, which is a whole lower level of sin here. You know what I mean? And then on the other hand, though, I want to be fair. Is it really the case that there's much of an ISIS threat left in Iraq at all now? Because after Iraq War III, America, and you're saying you were there, and Iran helped really blow those guys to hell mostly, right? Or not?
We took away all the ground the Islamic Caliphate controls. I think to answer your question, DC uses whichever answer is convenient for them at the time. So anytime anyone questions like, hey guys, what are we still doing in Iraq and Syria? And like most people didn't even know we had a base on the tri-border region there in Jordan until we tragically had 3 soldiers killed there. And the second that someone says, what are we doing there? They always do the fear mongering of like, well, do you remember ISIS? And when you say ISIS, people automatically flash to the graphic YouTube videos of the beheadings and all that. And they're like, oh my gosh, well, thank God we still have people there and they're running down all these ISIS folks. Well, number one, the data just doesn't support that. We took away all the ground the territorial caliphate controlled. We killed Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi with deliberated targeting. I don't think that really relies on us having these random outposts in the middle of nowhere. We've been able to conduct limited strikes against ISIS. ISIS has bigger problems right now than trying to project power into Europe and into the West. They're fighting for their survival. The Assad regime is hunting them. So if you question that narrative and you push back a little bit, then DC immediately pivots to, well, but Iran. There's this land bridge that Iran's now built between Tehran through Baghdad, going into Damascus and this critical ground out there in the deserts in the western desert of Iraq and the eastern deserts of Syria. That's critical to countering Iran. And then every now and again, if they're really being honest, they'll say, yes, and Russia too, because Russia and Assad are buddies. And so it's like, wait a sec. So the idea is we have these random scattered outposts over there that our enemies are well aware of that are supposed to counter Iran, but that doesn't make any sense because we got attacked 160 times by these militias before we did anything about it. We've gotten into some scrapes with the Russians, and it's again for what? We're gonna get into a shooting war with Russia over like the worthless deserts of eastern Syria. Like none of it makes sense when it's challenged, but they do use this fear mongering, and they say the entire reason why we're sending billions of dollars every year to the government of Iraq is because ISIS, and it's just Washington D.C. doublespeak. I think the fact that you have the entire apparatus of the military-industrial complex geared towards counterinsurgency and geared towards counterterrorism. We already lost Afghanistan, and that's gone and done. If this Middle East thing dries up, where does all that money and where does all that go? And then there's also the fact that, again, people don't want to admit that we screwed the entire thing up with the Iraq war based on lies.
I've been aware of this for a while. Have you? The idea of euthanasia, assisted dying. And like you, I always thought what they mean is people are terminally ill, they've got a long, debilitating, crushing, awful disease, slowly and in anguish and agony, propped up by drugs. Eventually, we grant them the dignity of an assisted death. Well, that all sounds perfectly reasonable, but there are all sorts of thresholds we might cross when reasoning ourselves to death. And it seems like Canada has crossed many of those thresholds, because being considered now for assistance in dying, it seems, are people that are incurably ill, which includes things like mental illness, could be deemed incurable. So depressed people, people with anorexia, and guess what's being discussed now? Poor people. Yep, you guessed it. It's depopulation, it's eugenics, it's Canada. But tell me, importantly, has the guy running the country got a nice haircut? Oh yeah, it's very nice. Oh well, probably they're really liberal then. Let's get into this in some more detail.
Today, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau introduced legislation to legalize physician-assisted suicide.
It's a deeply personal issue that affects...
It's a deeply personal issue. These are not that far from the sort of things that Harold Shipman said. Well, sometimes people just don't work anymore, and we have to turn them off. People are bad machines.
The bad machines don't know that they're bad machines, but the people at the factory know.
Harold Shipman was a doctor that just started killing elderly people because by his verdict, they were too old. He just decided, that's enough for you now, Mrs. Johnson. I've heard about all I'm willing to listen to about those corns. Night, night. You can't use reason and rationale to start eliminating people, or actually you can, and they are, and it's leading to dystopia.
Some believe it is their only option. We're very concerned about the exclusion of individuals with mental illness.
No one should be faced with such an impossible choice.
So right, they started it with, of course, if you're dying with cancer, oh God, but when you slowly and incrementally start to go, but what also about people who are a bit down in the dumps? I mean, like, there's points in my life, I'll tell you candidly, in the last few months, where if someone said, would you like to press this button and die? I'd go, yes. Bye. And I'm pretty glad that that option wasn't available to me. All of us are likely to feel depressed and suicidal at points in our lives because guess what? We live in a depressing and suicidal world, and this is part of it.
The federal government is defending its decision to delay the expansion of medically assisted death to include those suffering from mental illness. It's the second time they've pressed pause on the legislation.
Like, everything is like a game now. Let's press pause on the legislation and press end on that person's life. Everything's not a machine. It's not mechanical. We don't fully appreciate and understand reality. There are dimensions, or at least aspects, to reality and consciousness itself that we don't fully appreciate. And it's this assumption that we've arrived at the zenith of what it is to be human that's leading to this kind of dystopia, I believe.
Currently, medical assistance in dying has two tracks. First legalized in 2016 with safeguards, Track 1 refers to a request for made by a person whose death is reasonably foreseeable.
Reasonably foreseeable. Like, you've got liver cancer, it's spread, you're going to die, it's getting worse, you've got no will to live, you've spoken to everyone. Reasonable, I suppose. This is where they get us, isn't it? It's like they get you to agree, well, under some circumstances, would you agree that a person should have the right to end their own life? Yeah, I suppose so. In fact, maybe all of us have the right to end our own life, I suppose. But when you start talking about state intervention and facilitation, then we're getting into weird moral territory.
In 2021, MAID expanded to include Track 2.
What about Track 2? What's on Track 2?
Requests made by a person whose natural death is not reasonably foreseeable.
Well, that's everyone. That's all of us. Like, look at what the categories are now. Is your death naturally foreseeable? Yeah. Terminal cancer. Okay, tick. And then the other category is not reasonably, but that's everyone. Also, that's the opposite of one. It's reasonably foreseeable. Fair enough. We're meddling in God's domain. We'll admit that. And furthermore, what about the opposite of that? Anyone? Or what about this? We all start taking rifles and picking people off in the middle of the street. While we're at it, why don't we invade Yemen? We're already invading Yemen. Oh, good.
The number of reported MAID deaths in Canada has seen a steady increase, going from just over 1,000 in 2016 to over 13,000 in 2022.
Whee! It's the new COVID. But this time it's good. Extraordinary. It's popular, isn't it? This will be regarded as some sort of success, but this is depopulation, isn't it? Isn't that supposed to be a conspiracy theory, depopulation? 13,000 across a population the size of Canada doesn't represent anything at all. There's more to life than quantifying things through statistics. There's this other thing called governments killing members of its own population because they're depressed. Probably because they're a member of that population.
Psychiatrists are trained to deal with people in crisis, but some are now having their own crisis of confidence when it comes to medically assisted dying.
Our role as therapists, as psychiatrists, is in suicide prevention, and so to ask us to then facilitate suicide is very dissonant.
You're a psychiatrist, yes, and so what is your main function as a psychiatrist? To help people to be grateful and happy to live. And haven't you found that difficult? Yes, it is difficult, but it's very rewarding on those occasions when you're able... I'm going to stop you there. Why don't we just let them kill themselves and in fact encourage them and do it for them? What?
The laws around medical assistance in dying, or MAID, are set to expand, including Canadians with mental illness. But medical experts across the country warn Canada's healthcare system is not ready.
Yeah, because I suppose it is a bit of an inversion of your best practices to go from keeping people alive to killing people. Instead of selling you apples and bananas, we're going to shoot you. I mean, it's such a radical change of what the function of everything is. Isn't it odd? This is emerging out of a country like Canada, which till about 5-10 years ago, I just thought, what's Canada like? Oh, it's probably a bit like America, but just less mad and less intense. America's got the obligation and pressure of policing the world and generating the global culture. Go to Canada now. How are you feeling? I'm a bit down in the dumps. Oh, really? What are you doing?
But we know there's not really a clear consensus on a definition of, for example, what it means for someone to have a mental illness that is incurable or irremediable. So we already know there's this risk of inconsistent application of MAID.
Isn't that doctor, and don't be childish about her name's analysis very interesting? That it's too amorphous, diffuse and difficult to determine. It's a spectrum, it's a scale. And do you notice how often the culture is creating these weird things that are difficult to define, like, mentally ill. What is hate speech? We'll tell you later. Doesn't it seem like the opportunity for extraordinary authority is being created? Because we started with, this person is terminally ill. There's no foreseeable future for them. Would you agree? Yeah, there's no foreseeable future. And what about if there is a foreseeable future? Oh, bloody hell. And what if they're not even wanting to die, but we want them to die because they're truckers? We froze their bank accounts, they're hungry now and they're depressed. When does this end? Why does this begin? Can't you see and sense at least that there's a kind of rational, data-driven desire to control areas of reality that aren't the business of the government? That's what I'm trying to say.
Don't tread on us.
But first, let's welcome him on the program. Keith Knight, thank you for joining us today.
James Corbett, thank you so much for having me on the show. And I love the new website. Everything looks great at corbettreport.com.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Okay, so let's get into this book. Domestic Imperialism, 9 Reasons I Left Progressivism. It is being published by the Libertarian Institute. And I want to state right up front and off the bat, like the Voluntarist Handbook, this book is, of course, available for purchase for people who want to actually support the work, and please do so if you do appreciate it. It is also available as a free PDF download, and you can access it for free, for example, on archive.org. All the links will be in the show notes for anyone who is curious about this, anyone who wants to check it out, and then buy it, if you like. At any rate, I hope people will, at the very least, take a look through this book. But let's talk about this. Domestic Imperialism, 9 Reasons I Left Progressivism. Now, I know vaguely about your background and the points of your biography and story, Keith, and I think we probably come from broadly similar kind of background perspectives. Myself, as a Canadian, I was brought up in the Canadian indoctrination system, so I was a leftist kind of by default, as most Canadians are. The government loves you, and it's there to help you, and sure, it makes mistakes, but overall, it's a good thing, and everyone loves government, right? Well, that was the way I was brought up, and that was kind of what I believed by default. Luckily, I got myself out of that indoctrination, and from what I understand, you, too, counted yourself on the progressive or left side of the spectrum at one point, but clearly are not there anymore. Broken free of the spectrum, as I have. Let's talk about that. Talk about your background and how you came to write this book.
Originally, I was introduced into politics by my grandparents in Sedona at a very young age, and it seemed like the world was such a bizarre place. Here we have a bunch of people who want you to be treated equally, and on top of it, they want to give you stuff for free. And then there's a bunch of people who oppose that thing. They want you to have to pay for it. That means some people aren't going to have access to products or services. And if you're against treating people equally, that means you want some people to be treated unequally. How could anyone advocate such a thing? Took a while for me to understand things like opportunity cost, and the cost of increasing the money supplied simply doesn't make anything free, nor does the state first taxing you and then purchasing something on your behalf make it free. Also, this concept of equality, well, we of course are not equal to the state. They have a monopoly right to issue taxes, conscript men into fighting wars, start wars, and murder civilians by the thousands, engage in compulsory education, and a host of other things, constantly regulating voluntary interactions between consenting adults, a blatant crime if we saw anyone else do it. So when I originally saw the world as needing more compassion or equality, more income mobility, I still held true to those, but I think libertarianism is a far better way to achieve those ends than any system that advocates for a system of supremacy, where some people called the state have rights that no other organization does.
Number 4, government failure.
There is a gentleman by the name of Tom Hartman, pretty popular in progressive circles, who said there is one fatal flaw in the idea of voluntarism, libertarianism, anarchism, anything. And he says this is referred to as market failure. This involves when you have people, who are both very kind, virtuous, and very smart, then they could engage in an exchange. But the problem is in markets, you have a number of things, one of which is greed. One party could be very greedy and exploit the other. There could be information asymmetry. There could be power asymmetry, where one party who produces the printer has a heck of a lot more knowledge about printers than the consumer. Therefore, the state needs to coercively intervene and forcibly stop millions of people from making mutually beneficial voluntary interactions. Now, this is a genuinely true criticism, but it's true because it applies to all humans since the beginning of time, applies to all humans in every system today, and will apply to any system human beings engage in the future. So the knowledge asymmetry aspect can clearly be seen when you get pulled over by a police officer. There's huge knowledge asymmetry as to what you can and can't say in order for him to arrest you. When it comes to a lot of the lawyers in the legal system, the defendant and the prosecutor, tons of information asymmetry, even with the judge. When it comes to the average citizen and members of the FBI, CIA, NSA who have access to classified information, there's massive amounts of information asymmetry. So the idea that a state is justified in coercively intervening because of things like information asymmetry or greed or potential short-sightedness of people, those things exist and always will exist. The question is, since they'll always exist, what sort of system should we have? One where we could have competition among providers for a good or service and disassociate with bad actors who inevitably are greedy, are short-sighted, engage in information asymmetry, or one where we must fund them against our will and be put in jail if we resist. So that is the concept of government failure. It takes the market failure criticism and say, yes, it applies to the market. It also applies to the state, and much more so because the state doesn't face competition.
Is nice. But yeah, let's put up that first clip. They called it a national security supplemental, but it had nothing to do with America, right? Had nothing to do. Senate passes $95 billion aid package for Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan, despite Trump attacks, that evil Trump. This is from Politico. So everyone knows the story by now. They should. They tried to put this turkey through with the border language. You talked about it last week. The border stuff was total garbage, totally terrible stuff. And so they said, okay, we'll just take that out and we'll just give you a bill with aid. But we won't even try to put a little bit of sugar with the medicine. We'll just give you the aid bill. And so that's what they did. And as you mentioned, Senator Paul, Senator Vance, and a few others, they tried to filibuster last night. They were up all night. And in fact, Zero Hedge wrote about it, if you put that next one up. Here's Senator Paul getting ready. And the AP says, but 22 Republicans voted with nearly all the Democrats to pass the package 70-29. So 22 Republicans crossed over and voted with the Dems in the Senate. Supporters arguing that abandoning Ukraine could embolden Russian President Vladimir Putin. I mean, how long have we been hearing this argument? It's insane. But among those leading the last stand, Zero Hedge writes, was Senator Rand Paul, who vowed to hold out until, quote, hell freezes over, and spoke out about the massive national debt on the Senate floor, as you point out. Here's kind of a cute quote from Senator Paul. I love to talk. That's one of my favorite things to do. Yes, and I slept all day yesterday waiting for this. I'm going to take Adderall. Nah, I'm just kidding. He didn't want to get in trouble with Dad. He'd get in trouble with Dad and Mom. But that, valiant efforts, up all night, talking all night. Yeah, okay, they say, oh, ultimately they didn't. That's not the point. They brought a lot of attention that would have been brought to it. And I have a couple clips I want to play about it. The first one is Senator Paul on the floor.
Often the titles of bills before the legislature don't really represent what the bill stands for. The title of this bill should say, Ukraine first, America last, because that's what this is really about. Now, bills in the legislature, bills that come before the Senate, don't have pictures or covers on them like a book would have or a magazine. But if this bill had an image or a cover on the front of the bill, the image would be the migrant in New York who assaulted a police officer, was freed from jail on no bail, and gave the middle finger of both hands to America. That's what this bill is. It's the middle finger to America. This bill is the middle.
That's good. You can take it off. That's a pretty good.
That's pretty strong, but getting stronger all the time.
Yeah, that was great.
And I don't know whether you have more on him, but the one part I was watching this last night that I thought was just great because it was down my alley, and that was, but we don't have any money. There is no money. Yeah. And it's put the question of, where are you going to get the money for this? Yeah. But you know what? Nobody raised their hand. I know where it is. Let me explain it. So it didn't happen. Yeah. So it's the question that this a few of us over the years have been asking. Of course, you could go down the list of the questions you ask. Well, you don't have the money. How about authority? Where'd you get this authority to police the world and run an empire? They don't even ask those questions. That's why they're not forced to answer it. That's why it's really great when we bump into one of our libertarian journalists who do ask better questions. Yeah. And I would say we have a few more of those than we did 5-10 years ago.
Yeah, and progressives.
Yes, that's right.
People like Glenn Greenwald and others on both sides that are asking the good questions. But they didn't have a good argument for sending this money over. As you pointed out in your opening a few comments, we already sent $100 billion over there to Ukraine. It hasn't done a thing. All it's done is depleted our own weapons. We can't afford it. We don't have the money. But that money hasn't changed anything. So what do they have next? They can't say Ukraine is on the brink of victory because it's not. And everybody knows it. Even the Washington Post knows it. They know that Ukraine is losing and will lose. So what do they? All they have now is fear. Fear is the only thing they have left. And I have another clip. This is Tucker Carlson's first comments after his famous interview that we discussed with Putin. He has some great points that he's making about the war in Ukraine. Let's go to that 46-second mark if we can.
It became very clear to anyone paying attention several months ago that Ukraine cannot win its war against Russia. The Ukrainian military will not be able, even with Western backing, hundreds of billions of dollars of it, to expel the Russian military from parts of eastern Ukraine. Ukraine doesn't have the industrial capacity, neither does NATO or the United States, and it doesn't have the people. Russia has 100 million more in population than Ukraine does. And that means that further support from the West for the Ukrainian military only means more dead Ukrainians and a further degraded Western economy in the US and in Germany particularly. So it's not simply a fool's errand, it's self-destruction. It's insane, it's cruel, it's abetting the killing of an entire generation of Ukrainians.
Okay,
this is
very down there. So that's just cold hard facts, you know? It's cold facts.
This whole thing, this happened last night and the vote passed and passed easily in the coalition, and is there the things that many people, including us, have warned about, and that is the collusion of the rhino-type Republicans and McConnell himself, who's losing steam on the, on the leadership position. But, there are two houses, in the Congress, and now this has to come back. The whole thing should have, I don't know how much of it originated, but they used to always have to originate in house. It doesn't always happen anymore. But but the thing now is that what's the speaker going to do? And he has his positions where he was when he was a little more independent as representing his only district. But when you're in leadership, I was told once when I asked somebody, "Why are you voting that way? Why are you voting that? You used to vote with me all the time." And he looked at me and he says, "I'm in leadership now." So he had to be a follower because you're in leadership. But the big question, will Johnson's in a position where he can say, enough is enough. We're not going to put this nonsense up for a vote in the House because there'd be a better fight there too. So if you're thinking strictly in political position, he's in the middle of a mess, and he has no easy solution because he's getting benefits from some people who aren't exactly his political allies, but he does that because he becomes Speaker of the House. That's why the system is not a good system.